Good afternoon. My name is Jim Tabucci, and I have been asked to facilitate this part of the Tadaima program, which is titled Sacramento Japantown, the Demolition That Became a National Model. This will be a program that has two parts. The first part will be an informative presentation of Sacramento Japantown, community efforts to save it, and Sacramento's destruction of it. The second part will be a question and answer discussion session from our panel that consists of members of the group called Reclaim Sacramento Japantown. At this point, I would like to introduce you to our panel. Our first panelist is Jamie Katayanagi, leader of the Reclaim Sacramento Japantown group. In her day job, she is a civil servant who works in public health. In her free time, she enjoys researching family history, which is what sparked this journey to rebuild Sacramento's lost Japantown. Next is Michelle Huey, Strategic Communications Project Manager at the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence. She has worked in a variety of roles at My Sister's House and Asian Women's Home, which are organizations that serve Asian and Pacific Islander sexual assault and domestic violence survivors. She is a Yonsei and third-generation Chinese American whose activism was sparked by her grandmother's stories of Tule Lake and Walerga. Our third panelist is Priscilla Ochida. She is the former executive director of the Japanese American Citizens League and served for 3 decades as a chief of staff and legislative director in the California State Legislature. She conducted over 10 years of research into the firing of Japanese American employees by the state of California after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the subsequent U.S. Supreme Court decision in Ex parte Endo. Her work led to the development and passage of the 1982 California Redress Bill, the first successful Japanese American reparations bill in the nation. We will now show our informative video of the history of Sacramento Japantown. For all of you as viewers, please watch the video, and in the comment section on your screen, please write down your thoughts and questions. After the video, we will have time to answer questions and provide more commentary. Please show the video now.
Following World War II, the city of Sacramento pioneered the use of redevelopment to reimagine its urban core. The blueprint for Sacramento's Capitol Mall project became a model for the nation. Redevelopment, often referred to as slum clearance, reshaped American cities and created new urban identities. The impact on communities of color was an extension of decades of racist policies to effect the destruction of Sacramento's Japantown. The 1954 redevelopment of Sacramento's West End displaced hundreds of businesses and thousands of residents in Japantown.
Early immigrant Japanese referred to Sacramento as Sakuramento. Utilizing Japanese phonetics, Sakura was transformed into Sakura, the Japanese word for cherry blossom. Sacramento's Japantown, a segregated community dating back to the 1880s, was home to one of the most significant Japanese communities in the United States. By population percentage in the 1920s, Sacramento had the most Japanese of any American city.
The city of Sacramento created the West End, which covered the area west of the state capitol to the Sacramento River as a segregated district for persons of African or Mongolian descent. Japanese settlement in the city was restricted to the West End. The Japanese quarter, which became Sacramento Nihonmachi, was located in the older section of Sacramento, bounded by 2nd Street to 5th Street, L Street to O Street.
By 1910, Japantown had developed into a separate ethnic community, primarily in response to a growing white exclusion movement that relegated Japanese to the West End. Valentine McClatchy, founder and owner of the Sacramento Bee, was an early and vocal anti-Japanese advocate. Between 1906 and 1945, McClatchy was responsible for 90 racially demeaning anti-Japanese editorial cartoons. The Bee amplified the city's segregationist policies. Despite anti-Japanese barriers, Japantown prospered. Japantown had a familiar feel to recent immigrants from Japan. Japan Alley was the heart of Japantown, located on the block bordered by L Street, 4th Street, Capitol, and 3rd Street. Japan Alley bisected the block.
Sacramento Japantown grew into a major hub in Northern California because of its size and ability to provide a full range of services. Japanese communities in the Sacramento Valley had established their own business districts, but none compared with Sacramento Japantown's commercial operations. Customers traveled from Vacaville, West Sacramento, Woodland, Marysville, Penryn, Loomis, Clarksburg, Walnut Grove, and Florin to shop in Japantown. Sacramento remained a hub for Japanese American communities even after World War II.
Sacramento Japantown weathered the agricultural recession of the 1920s and the Great Depressions of the 1930s and continued to blossom. The bombing of Pearl Harbor, however, created an instantaneous threat to the community. On May 7, 1942, the 4th Army Command issued orders for the forced removal and incarceration of 8,600 Japanese Americans from within the city of Sacramento. Given only a week's notice to report to the Memorial Auditorium with only what they could carry, businesses and families sold cars and other property that could not be taken to the prison camps at fire sale prices. By May 13, 1942, the first group of 3,800 left aboard buses from Memorial Auditorium for the Assembly Center at Willerga. The Sacramento Union wrote, "Japantown has been blitzed. A few days ago, Lower Capitol Avenue and N Street were chock full of Japanese grocery stores, furniture marts, bait shops, restaurants, rooming houses, and other businesses. But last night, that district was full of for lease signs on homes, new management placards in stores, and heaps of receipts and other commercial papers piled on the sidewalks."
Earl Warren, Attorney General of California, is notable for his anti-Japanese efforts that provided a backdrop for Sacramento's actions. In 1942, he was a prominent proponent of the forced removal of Japanese Americans. Between 1944 and 1948, the Attorney General filed over 200 escheat suits against lands owned by Japanese Americans, charging that the lands were purchased in violation of the Alien Land Acts of 1913 and 1920. Japanese had a choice of fighting the suits in court or compromise out of court by paying the state 1/2 of the land's appraised value. The California legislature appropriated $200,000 to fund the Attorney General's program to take property from Japanese landowners.
The path to the demolition of Japantown was led by the Sacramento City Council. On May 28, 1943, the Sacramento City Council and Mayor Tom Monk joined the Home Front Commandos to unanimously pass Resolution 207, which stated that we are opposed to the return of any Japanese from concentration camps to their former locations, and we endorse the orders made by General John DeWitt of the Western Defense Command that all Japanese be confined in concentration camps and that they not be returned to any Pacific Coast state. The resolution foreshadowed the unwelcome reception Japanese faced when returning to Sacramento.
By 1950, the Japanese American community had formed social and economic bonds similar to those that existed before the war. Japantown defied predictions and recovered. The existence of Japantown, however, was not secure. As a community resettled in Japantown, Sacramento had already begun to formulate plans for the demolition of West End's Japantown. The West End was the city's first original business district and welcomed people from around the world. Despite its development as a segregated community, it was the city's most populated, diverse, integrated, and historic neighborhood. The population of the West End was made up of 21% African Americans, 30% Asian Americans, and 13% Latin Americans. The demographics of the West End reflected a long history of segregationist practices that restricted non-white persons to the West End and limited their access to new subdivisions that were being developed. In the 1940s and 50s, city leaders and the Sacramento Bee began to portray the West End as a blighted, disease-ridden skid row.
In 1945, California became the first state in the nation to pass a Community Redevelopment Act. In 1949, Sacramento commissioned a survey of 244 blocks in the downtown area. 65 blocks in the West End were identified as blighted. In 1950, the city established its redevelopment agency and identified 62 blocks in the West End of Sacramento as Redevelopment Area 1.
The redevelopment agency characterized the West End as a full-blown three-dimensional, horrible, filthy slum. The Sacramento Bee, led by publisher Valentine McClatchy, amplified the city's position. In 1950, the city of Sacramento proposed a Capitol Mall project, a plan to connect the state capitol building to the riverfront, a path that went straight through Japantown. Realtor W.C. Wright challenged the city and said that redevelopment was not meant for a city like Sacramento that didn't have slums, and that Japantown had homes as nice as any other part of the city. After 2 years of debate, the redevelopment agency reduced the scale of the proposed redevelopment from 62 blocks to only 15 blocks, the entirety of Japantown.
The 7,000 Japanese Americans living in Sacramento had been relocated first to the Walerga Assembly Center, then to Tule Lake Incarceration Camp, and often to a third prison camp. In a matter of a few years, Sacramento was again attacking the community. The Japanese community felt unfairly targeted. The proposed forced relocation now came under the guise of civic progress rather than the former military necessity. The city's intention to demolish Sacramento Japantown was clear, and Japanese Americans and other organizations decided to fight the proposed redevelopment. Representatives of the Japanese American Citizens League, the Nisei Veterans of Foreign War, Japanese community leaders, merchants, property owners, and residents convened at the Buddhist Church Auditorium and organized the Japanese American Redevelopment Study Association, JARSA or JARSA. JARSA was formed to do its own independent redevelopment research and to legally represent the community in negotiations. JARSA created a $6,000 defense fund and formed a 15-member advisory board that included Dr. Akio Hayashi and attorneys Henry Takeda, Mamoru Sakuma, and Dean Itano. African-American attorney Nathaniel Colley teamed up with Mamoru Sakuma to represent West End residents.
Nisei leaders faced a formidable task against established political foes. Anti-Japanese sentiment was still a barrier, and the community had little public support or political power. The Sacramento Bee was relentless as a mouthpiece for redevelopment. The Capitol Mall project was endorsed by the Sacramento Chamber of Commerce, the Builders Exchange, the Association of Landscape Architects, the American Society of Civil Engineers, the Sacramento Area Planning Association, and the League of Women Voters. On June 29, 1954, the City Council held a second public meeting and a large number of residents from Japantown were in attendance. Mamoru Sakuma argued that the Sacramento Redevelopment Agency had made no effort to engage residents of the impacted project area. He accused the agency of having no plan beyond demolition. He stated, "The agency has been so evasive, we can't put our finger on a thing. We are not interested in what the agency might do, can do, or will possibly do. We want to know what actually is proposed to be done." He admonished the agency for turning down offers to meet with JARSA. "I believe it is to the credit of the people of this area that they have, until now, the sincere belief the agency would get together with them and attempt to work out the problems," concluded Sakuma. The Sacramento Bee printed political propaganda against minority opposition, running front-page editorials and political cartoons clowning those in opposition. The Bee wrote, "Any community leader who would reject such an opportunity might properly be called the representative of blight."
JARSA and the NAACP asked that the city assist residents and relocate businesses. Non-white residents of the West End faced racism and discrimination and were excluded from all white neighborhoods. The organizations asked the city for support. Henry Taketa argued, "We sincerely feel it is reasonable and just for us to ask that appropriate safeguards be made by the Sacramento Redevelopment Agency to protect the economy and livelihood of those who may be dislocated or required to relocate or even give up their business interests." Nathaniel Cawley, representing 32 black business owners, feared that for whites-only signs on new structures built under redevelopment would replace the alleged conditions with the blight of bigotry. Frank Yoshimura, representing Nisei Veterans of Foreign Wars, characterized the proposal as an abuse of power of eminent domain and un-American. Despite arguments from JARSA and NAACP, the agency could not guarantee minority groups would not be subjected to some pressure and prejudices if they attempted to move into certain residential areas.
On July 1st, 1954, San Francisco developer Ben Swig proposed to fund the development of a pedestrian shopping mall between 2nd and 5th Street and Allen Capitol Avenue, the heart of Japantown. The proposal proved to be the final nail. The City Council called a special meeting on July 20th, 1954 to make a decision on Swig's offer. Attorney Dean Itano, director of JARSA, proposed the agency set reasonable standards for altering, improvement, reconstructing, modernizing, and rehabilitating existing structures, and allow us an opportunity to try to meet those standards, and by this method achieve the objective of redevelopment. Toko Fuji, representing the Sacramento chapter of JCL, stated, "Japanese Americans as a particular minority group are just barely recovering from the tragedy of the recent mass evacuation of World War II. We hope that safeguards will be ensured for every resident of Sacramento, regardless of his economic status, and that the City Council will defend the needs and right of every person, regardless of race or color." In a final effort, JARSA proposed to retain a one-block section of the redevelopment area where Japanese American merchants could consolidate their businesses. The Sacramento Redevelopment Agency immediately dismissed the idea, arguing it was an obstacle to large-scale construction projects.
On July 22, 1954, the Sacramento City Council unanimously approved the agency's Capitol Mall project. The community initially thought that they had swayed city voters to spare Sacramento Japantown. A $1.5 million bond measure asking the public to pay for the initial cost of the Capitol Mall project failed passage in the November 1954 elections. Within days of the bond measure's defeat, the Sacramento Redevelopment Agency implemented a new funding mechanism approved by the California legislature in 1952. Sacramento became the first city in the state to utilize tax increment financing, which did not require a public vote. Tax increment financing allowed the city to use future tax revenues to pay for a city-issued bond.
On May 5th, 1955, the federal government approved the financing plan, and on July 1st, 1956, the redevelopment agency issued its first tax increment bond of $2 million. Governor Goodwin Knight operated the crane that brought down the first building, a two-story house near the corner of 6th and Capitol on January 28, 1957. By March 1961, all 310 parcels in the area had been demolished. Over 300 businesses and 4,000 residents were forcibly evicted. Kanji Nishijima, owner of L&M Appliances and others, questioned the city's calculation of fair market values for impacted homes and buildings. Appraisals did not reflect property improvements or pre-condemnation values. Offers were below the original purchase prices. The redevelopment agency also refused requests from property owners such as Toko Fuji to continue to operate rental properties until the buildings were scheduled for destruction. As a result, property owners suffered lost income as the building sat empty for 2 to 3 years.
Redevelopment created a human void. In 1950, 4,467 people lived in the census tract that included Sacramento Japantown. After redevelopment, only 377 lived in the area, a loss of population of 92%. The project initiated a redevelopment cycle that impacted minority communities in Sacramento. Many of Sacramento Japantown's residents relocated to Oak Park, a neighborhood that became a redevelopment target area in 1973. Sacramento Japantown businesses relocated to the 10th Street corridor. The new Sacramento Japantown was later bisected by Highway 50. Downtown underwent multiple rounds of redevelopment, each phase removing another community. In 2023, a crushing need for housing has resulted in the transformation of once touted government buildings that line the Capitol Mall into Section 8 housing.
Ironically, the block that was once the center of Sacramento Japantown was cleared and is again an empty lot.
Thank you for showing that, our video there. The second part of our discussion here is to host the panel discussion. And before doing that, I would like to thank Priscilla Ochita for leading the Reclaim Sacramento Japantown team in the researching, documenting, and scripting of the video that we have just seen. To get us started, I just thought I would ask a few questions, and then maybe we can go to the chat on YouTube and see if there's any questions there. But to get us started, I thought I'd just kind of go around our panel here and ask for what is your personal connection to Sacramento Japantown? Why don't I start with you, Jamie, since you're our leader here?
Hi, I'm Jamie Katiyanagi, and my personal connection is actually my husband's family. They have been in Sacramento for over 100 years. They lived and owned a business, a print shop in the heart of Japantown. And they've been members of the Buddhist church and part of the community ever since. I personally was not aware of the history until I started researching the family history, doing some, genealogy, ancestry.com, and came across some of the information of his family with the print shop. And I wanted to see where the print shop was. And so I started looking at maps, and then that slowly led to learning about some of the history of, the once Japantown, what was once there, which even though I've was born and raised here in Northern California, I didn't know most of that history. I definitely didn't know there was a thriving Japantown. So that kind of led us on our journey of where we're here today. So yes, that's my connection.
That's great. Thank you, Jamie. Michelle?
Yeah, so I'm a fourth generation Sacramentan, and I've lived in Sacramento my whole life. And I've heard my grandma telling me about stories about a hotel that her family used to own. And I didn't realize that the hotel was part of Japantown. And I didn't realize there was a Japantown, and I didn't realize the extent of it until fairly recently when I started looking more into my family's history. Right, so my grandma would tell me stories about her father breaking up their radio after Pearl Harbor was attacked and walking down Capitol Avenue and throwing it in the river so that he wouldn't be suspected of communicating with Japan. Or she would come home and wash sheets and change all the bedding of the hotel. And then my grandmother met my grandfather in Japantown. Because the way that Sacramento Japantown worked is that farmers would come in from around the area to do business or to socialize in Sacramento Japantown in this hub. And my grandmother's hotel would house a lot of those farm workers and then drive them out to whatever farm they were working at that moment. And so my grandfather was one of those farm workers. And so his family would come in every week to go to church, which is a church that my great-grandparents founded. And then at that church is where they met. So as I'm digging into all this history about my family, I'm realizing how much of it is intertwined with the dynamics of Japantown and having that tight, close-knit community.
That's great, and it's great that you're able to capture some of those stories, and I hope you're writing them down too for the future, right? Yeah. Priscilla, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, my grandfather moved his family to Sacramento after the 1906 earthquake, and in 1907 he started Nippon Theater, and then about 100 years ago, this year, he started the Wakano Ura restaurant, which was a chop suey sukiyaki place. That was in 1923. My aunt ran the Ebner Hotel, which was a prefectural hotel for Aichi-ken, for those people who came from Aichi-ken. And we were impacted by the redevelopment.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and for me personally, so I grew up in Stockton, and all I knew was my history in Stockton until I started digging a little bit further. My grandparents owned and operated a department store called Tabuchi's Department Store in downtown Stockton. And I came across, just in digging through the history, I came across this receipt book that said, Sakiyama Store, Sacramento, Stockton. And I'm like, wait a second. So my grandfather actually started the Sakiyama Store in Stockton, which then became Tabuchi's Department Store. But he started actually in Sacramento. And so I retraced back the Sakiyama Store in Sacramento, and it was right there on, I think it was 1217 3rd Street. So if you look at that square block that is vacant right there, my grandfather started off in the dry goods business right on that, where that vacant square is right now. Kind of the cool thing is, if we think about all of our interconnections here, it's possible that our grandparents or great-grandparents knew each other, right? I mentioned that, we talk about Osakaya, which is the manju shop, that's still in existence right now in Sacramento. Well, that was right next door to Sakiyama Dry Goods Store. So undoubtedly, right, my grandfather and my grandmother, they went to the old Osakaya there and got their confectionery goods. So even though we think of it as being, way past history beyond our time, still in effect, it's likely that our relatives knew each other back then, because it was a small world, right? So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to switch gears a little bit and just talk a little bit about Reclaim Sacramento Japantown. So Jamie, you are the leader of this group, right? And
So they say.
yeah, yeah. If you wouldn't mind, just share with us a little bit about, what this group is and, how you kind of got started in forming it.
Okay, so I mentioned a little bit about my tie to Sacramento Japantown, my husband's family, which was, I believe, would have been right across the street from the dry goods store, because they were, I think, 1328 or 12, something like that, 4th Street. So they would have been right across the street. So yeah, I think about those things that, that they would have, been in these stores, that we look at these pictures and everything. Anyhow, so when I was researching my husband's family, and like I said, I wanted to see what's there now. Like, where was the print shop? I found the address, and I wanted to see where it was. And I pulled up a Google Maps, and that's when it hit me that Japantown was actually what we now have. The heart of it was like 301 Capitol, which is now just an empty lot. And so I really didn't know much about the redevelopment at that point. I started kind of digging into things, and, researching a little bit. And I had this crazy idea. It really started out as, I'm researching, finding this information, getting all excited every little, bit that I find. And I see that the property's for sale. It's owned by the state. And so I said, I tell my husband, I remember telling my husband, I was like, oh my gosh, wouldn't that be amazing if somehow we could get the property, 301 Capitol, and we could, just return it to the community somehow in a meaningful way, whether it's a memorial, whether it's, somehow, rebuild Japantown, a cultural learning center or something. And he thought it was kind of a cute idea. He said, okay, how much is it? I'm like, it's $16 million. It's okay. We'll figure that out later. No big deal. And, he kind of chuckled at it. But the more I started researching and seeing the history and realizing no one knew this, the more people I talked to, no one knew the history. And I'm like, wow, how? It was a huge, thriving community. How do we not know this? People have lived here all their lives. And around that same time, I started seeing, so I had this idea, like, it'd be great to have, something there. I want more than just a memorial placard or, historical monument type of thing. And I started seeing legislation for, Bruce's Beach, which was a piece of land that was returned to an African-American family in Southern California. It had been taken through racism and eminent domain. And so through this legislation, it was given back to the family. And that started making me think that, hey, this might be possible. I think that it's, probably, if it's ever going to happen, this is the right time, politically, the right climate. People are starting to realize, starting to learn the history and starting, I think, to recognize the injustice that has happened, in a lot of the minority communities. And so, I said, okay, just at least to get the information, the history out there, the story, I'm going to start a Facebook page. And, I think that there's other people in the community that may be interested in this. And so that's kind of how it got started the Facebook page. I was a little overwhelmed with how many people started reaching out and the support. And so that's what's kind of brought us to this point.
Yeah, that's great. So that's actually where I heard about it first as well, was through the Facebook page, right? So I just visited that a couple of days ago, and when I looked at there are over 5,000 followers on that Facebook page right now. And if you go through and you just click on who the followers are, right? Like, I would say a minority of those followers are Japanese American, right?
Mhm.
So there's big interest, there's wide interest on this. And Michelle, if you can just kind of chime in, with your perspective on this. Why do you think there's such widespread interest, and how has social media kind of played into this?
Well, I think right now, especially among people my age, there's a big interest in Japan. And, you know, like I grew up, like Pokemon was like an integral part of my my growing up. And so I think that that's part of it, right? And at least for me, the reason why I'm interested in it is because, like, a little bit of jealousy from seeing San Francisco Japantown and Los Angeles's Little Tokyo, and for the community to have a place to gather and connect and find other Japanese Americans. There are so many around Sacramento, and we don't really have a gathering place. And I think I also don't realize the extent of how many Japanese Americans there are because we're so dispersed. And I think there's a growing interest, one, among people of my generation, both Japanese Americans who are connecting with their roots and others, as well as like older generations who either remember Japantown or whose families didn't teach them much about their culture because of a desire to assimilate after camp. And they're trying to reconnect with their roots and find other people. And so I think Jamie said it, you know, it feels like the right time. There's a lot of momentum and there's a lot of interest in this, in the zeitgeist.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Yeah, and I would say that, you know, whenever I mention Sacramento Japantown to my friends or people that I run into, and I start to do this kind of visualization of overlaying where Sacramento Japantown was on the existing Sacramento, right? I'm like, okay, so you know where Golden One Center is, where the Kings play, right? That was Sacramento Japantown. You see where that Wells Fargo building is? That was Sacramento Japantown, right? And just to go through this, you know, you see where that freeway runs through. That was Sacramento, and people are just in disbelief. They have no idea or comprehension how big and how widespread it was. And so I think there is that kind of astonishment that's there. And it's just, it's great to see that, you know, some of these concepts and thoughts are being resurrected. I know that several times in our slideshow, we talked about that there were officials within the city and the state that called Sacramento Japantown blighted. Right. They even had the characters that were, you know, cartoons that were on the front page of the Sacramento Bee and talked about the blightedness of this area. And I think one thing that we should probably do is really just kind of dispel that first and for all, right? Because it wasn't true, right? And we have some video evidence to show that. And I think we have a clip that we can show. It's probably about 2 minutes here that just shows that the video of how vibrant Sacramento Japantown was. And I think through that, we can really dispel this whole philosophy that, yeah, it was a blighted community. So with that, if we can just go ahead and show that quick video.
If you look at it, it looks just like any other American place, any other American community. There's not trash on the sidewalk. It's clean. People are doing what we would consider all American activities. So one wonders about the perspective the city had at that time to call this blighted. I mean, it's no more blighted than if we walked down Capitol Mall today and saw sort of the homeless living by the sides of the street, and the empty the empty streets and the closed businesses. But this was not that. This was active businesses, people doing things that everybody else did: Boy Scout troops, basketball games, churches, community organizations, businesses. People came to Japantown because sometimes they couldn't get jobs with a white business, like Fred and Harold Owe opened Owe's Pharmacy in Japantown because they couldn't get jobs as pharmacists with anybody else.
Priscilla, can you share what we're seeing here?
Oh, now I think we're looking at the demolition of Japan. Yeah. It happened very, very quickly. The first building was taken down in 1957, and 4 years later, there was nothing left. It was completely demolished. Everything down to the foundations was gone. I remember as a child walking through Japantown when it was active, and it's and the community that was there. It was a very, very close community, and people, and they talked about vagrants and everything. There, I didn't see any vagrants there. At least they weren't any Japanese vagrants. If there were vagrants, they were not us. They weren't among the African American community or the Asian community or the Latino community. They were people from other communities. So this is happened very, very quickly. It not only removed Japantown, but it removed our cultural icons. I mean, Japantown had been in existence since 1880, starting with the Issei's, and what they built, and they bought a piece of Japan with them, and that sort of became integrated in the town of Japantown. If you went down Japan Alley, there were like lanterns hanging there. You can hear the sound of shamisen being played from some of the restaurants. They had this, and it continued. Japan Alley continued. And the next block, they had all these gardens set up with the stages, and they'd have like judo performances there and everything. We had a band. I think it was called the Nighthawks. They played jazz. Some days, they would go down to the Momo Club, which was African American business, and we had another establishment on L Street. So it was like a very, very American community, but it had also this cultural aspect that held us together as a community and bound us together. It bound us to who we were. And following World War II, and then ultimately the destruction of Japan, I think we lost a lot of that. We lost our identity, and everybody tried to become more Americanized after the incarceration experience. But destroying our roots in Sacramento really sort of took away who we were. And so we had the highest outmarriage rate of any population, any ethnic population after World War II. Everybody married somebody else. I guess everybody was trying to be something that we weren't, or that we couldn't be anymore.
Yeah. So can you imagine being one of those families watching your business, your building being demolished, right? So it happened in Sacramento through redevelopment, right? And that was in the late 50s. Now that was the start across the United States, and I know that it happened in Stockton. So the Tabuchi's department store that my grandparents owned, they owned their building, and redevelopment came to Stockton as well. I remember being a 4-year-old boy sitting in the car on my mom's lap, watching as the ball and chain crushed through the walls of Tabuchi's department store. And I remember being on her lap and crying, watching that demolition happen. And telling my mom, through my tears, I'm like, I'm going to build that store back bigger than ever, right? And here I was a 4-year-old, so even right now, I still feel the trauma of that redevelopment that happened. And so it wasn't just in Sacramento, but it happened in other places as well.
In 1956, they put our house up, and they took it somewhere. And since 1956, I looked all over Sacramento for where they moved that house because it was relocated.
Did you ever find it?
No, I've never found it, but I have literally looked down every street downtown looking for that house again, the house that we lived in. And my mother came home crying every single day every single weekend, because they couldn't find another place to live, and they're all white covenants, and they couldn't find a place to live. So
So Priscilla, if you if you can just kind of, fill us in with your thoughts on this, right? How much did racism play into all of this destruction of Sacramento Japantown?
He had all Caucasian, middle-aged city council. And through their lens, these are people, I mean, they've gone through World War II, they fought Japan, but there's this continuing inability to separate Japanese Americans who fought in the famed 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They had been as American as anybody could be. And yet when they came back, they became the Jap again. And there's, so you see this steady progress where you have the resolution and then redevelopment centers almost right on top of J-Town. They could have gone in lots of different ways, but it was J-Town. And they didn't take out just the 1 block or 2 blocks that was in the way to make the Capitol Mall. They took the whole thing out, right? All 15 blocks. And I'm thinking, if we were a different color, if we were Caucasians who owned that property, would they have not discussed with us a little bit more about, accommodating, that we could have had more business, we could have kept a block, we could have had help in relocating, because obviously they created the West End for African Americans to live, for Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, South Asians to live. That was a place because we were all people of color, and they realized that we had nowhere to go. So, but for them, we were a slum. We were blighted. And there are other areas that looked just the same as we do, but they weren't slums or they were blighted. It was only because the West End was the colored section, and that made it so much easier to demolish it and not recognize the rights of those who owned there, not even allowing people to rent their property out for another 2 or 3 years. It was, and when I look at it today, I see that same area, and now we're going back to replacing the Capitol Mall with housing, Section 8 housing. And I'm thinking, when they demolished the main block of Japantown, it became the Sacramento Union Building, which was subsequently demolished, and now it's just an empty lot. And I think we've gone all the way back, like a full circle back to where we were. And the cost of that was a loss of our cultural identity in our homes and our businesses. And so I have to think that racism was a key part of what happened to us, that it wouldn't have happened if it had been another type of ownership, if it had been Caucasian, if it hadn't been us.
Yeah, and thank you, Priscilla, for also mentioning it was not just Japanese Americans who were dislocated, right? That it was African Americans, it was Filipino Americans and Chinese Americans that were also dislocated. But it was the complete destruction of Sacramento Japantown, right? And actually previous to that, and I think, Michelle, you had mentioned to me privately that, yeah, in all honesty, this was all Native American soil to begin with, right? And so we have to continue to recognize that as well, right? So thank you for that. What I'd like to do is just kind of maybe go to one of the items that came up in the chat. And if I look at this, there was one comment about Sacramento City Resolution 43-207, right? And someone was wondering, I don't think Monk's resolution has ever been officially rescinded. I think that has been rescinded, right? Through my research, I think it was in 2014 when the city council finally repealed that resolution. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? That's just my understanding of that. Priscilla, do you have history behind that?
I'm sorry, I was reading the comments.
Yeah.
Question again?
Yeah, if you recall, Monk's resolution.
Yes.
Back in 1943.
Berg, that's probably the person who put down, it has never been rescinded. So we've gone back to rescind other resolutions that were passed during that period.
Uh-huh.
or at least, to rescind them.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about going forward, right? So what is the hope of this group of our panelists? Now that we have kind of captured the memory and the history of Sacramento Japantown, what are some possibilities going forward? Right? Jamie, why don't I ask you that question?
I think that's a great question. We as a group are still in the very early stages of this. So at least in my mind, what I would like to see, and I think a lot of the group supports that idea, is the big dream would be to acquire 301 Capitol Mall and somehow, bring it back to the community in a meaningful way. Whether, that meant retail spaces that include, Japanese American owned businesses, or I think, cultural learning center where we can bring the history in is really what I would want to see, something along those lines. Especially here in Sacramento, every fourth grader goes to Sutter's Fort on a field trip, and they learn the history of, this great man in Sacramento and, all of the things, but they don't know, anything about Japantown or the history there. Honestly, they don't know a whole lot about, the war impact on the community, let alone the redevelopment. And so I would really like to have a place that's in some way brings that history to the community. Maybe some of those artifacts that are out there, that we don't really have, like a museum. We've had some great exhibits, at our museums, but, just to have an actual like Japanese American, cultural learning center would be amazing.
Mm-hmm.
With that said, that's the big dream. And like I said, we're in the early stages of it. So, we want feedback from the community. We want ideas to kind of guide us in where we're going with that. At the very least, I have to say, we will have some amazing, memorial celebration of some type. Like I said, the big dream, I want a cultural learning center or museum. But yeah, we still don't know what the final end result will look like. But that's the path that we're on, is trying to find a way to meaningfully celebrate the history there.
Yeah, it's really great. Somebody on the chat on YouTube actually mentioned that San Jose Japantown has an augmented reality exhibit. Right. I was fortunate to be able to actually take that walking tour within San Jose, and it's really cool. Art that just comes alive on your cell phone as you're walking around, and I think one of my favorite parts of it was just seeing an overlay of a historic sign on top of a current sign that's there right now, just to see how things were before. And if you think about, the hundreds of businesses that were in Sacramento Japantown in the past, just to, get pictures of those and see where they were. And for me to, go back to 3rd Street and actually stand in front of Sakayama dry goods store where my grandfather had worked in the past, to me would be just an experience that I would treasure. So who knows, maybe with technology that's a way to also allow us to bring back, maybe not in a bricks and mortar sense, but to use a technology to experience that kind of approach as well. Yeah. Jamie, do you have anything to add there?
Most definitely. And, we are looking at some ways to, at least in the meantime, bring some of that history. I like the AI tour that they did in San Jose. I thought that was a fabulous idea, but at least to bring some of the graphics, down to like 301 Capitol. We've discussed, the group knows here that we've discussed putting some graphics up where some of those buildings were, and maybe, QR codes that kind of explain some of the history so people can, the community can understand what was there. And not just for, I think it would be great to really highlight both Japantown and what it was before the war, and as well as what it was after and what happened to it. Because as we've described, that it was, the West End was very diverse. And so, what it was after the war was very different. And I think we need to show all of the history that's there, and highlight so many other things that we didn't even get to touch on, just the Japanese, influence on Sacramento. We had mentioned that, a lot of them were farmers that came into Japantown because they weren't welcome in white businesses. Then we look at what is celebrated, here in Sacramento. We celebrate Farm to Fork. We just had the big festival. I mean, this is, the pride of Sacramento. Well, where did that come from? It came, it was built on the backs of these laborers, not just the Japanese American, but all of the laborers, all of the West End, community. And so I think we need to highlight all of that story and really show it wasn't just one part of, it wasn't just like, okay, there was this section of Sacramento that is now gone, that was Japantown, that was the West End, very diverse. But this is truly, without it, I mean, that's taking out a huge part of Sacramento's history, and how Sacramento was built. So yeah, I think that it's really important just to find a way to share all of this history, with the community. And that's my biggest goal with this project is to bring that to the community, because like we mentioned a few times, even, some Japanese Americans that have family here in Sacramento that their families were personally, affected, still really did not know much of the history, and, the more we talk to people in the community, they're shocked, on learning this history, and so I think it's super important that that we make sure that history is known, and that we also, along the way, we have, we want to collect as much of the written history, from those that we still have with us, the oral history on that. So yeah. That's my ideas, and that's kind of, my goal for the group. And so, like I said, we're still in the early stages of seeing exactly what that'll look like, but we have big plans.
That's great. Thank you for that. There was a comment on the YouTube chat that says, do you see any way to connect or build with other ethnic groups who have faced the same kind of removal and community destruction? Indigenous Americans, African Americans, et cetera, right? I think that's a great idea. If you look at Sacramento, it's one of the most diverse communities in the country, diverse and also integrated, right? And so it does make sense for us to consider that as well. I just had a chance to visit the Wing Look Museum in Seattle, and I believe that's the only Pan-Asian museum that exists in the United States, other than maybe the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., right? But they do a great job of really integrating the Asian American experience that's there. And so maybe that could be a model for something that becomes even more multicultural. There's mention about someone leading an augmented reality tour by holding up pictures, right? And that's the perfect way, right? So the idea of doing these types of tours through augmented reality is another idea. Someone says, I'd like to see something that would bring in more daily foot traffic, like an Oto's or event space. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Let's bring back Japan Alley.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's just lots of ideas and chat that's going on. So it does sound like there's a lot more interest in what's going on here. Realizing we're at the top of the hour now, just want to thank our panelists. Want to thank Tadaima Kimiko Mar for allowing us to share in this space. And as we talk about this is really just the start, right? And that there's more to come through this whole initiative. So thank you very much. Appreciate everybody's attendance, and hopefully more people will be able to see this as this gets archived on YouTube. All right. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.